electrical energy at a very high frequency, and they started to notice that tools would disappear after this, and they couldn't find them. They finally filmed it, and they found that when they blasted this arc welding thing, that there would be this big black hole that would appear in the room. And they discovered that, in fact, it was dematerializing objects and that they wouldn't come back. So this is what led them to do increasing amounts of research, discovering that electrical energy is one way that you can sort of pop this hole between space-time and time-space and get through to this realm down here. Well, they tried to send a ship of sailors through. And unfortunately, apparently there was an inconsistency in the hull. The ship's hull was kind of used like an antenna to allow this energy to form around the ship properly. They put coils on the ship, and there were coils offshore. The ship apparently got caught up in this energy flow. It manifested up in Philadelphia, hence the Philadelphia experiment. It was originally in the Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and then it popped back to the shipyard. The sailors, some of them were actually embedded in the hull. Some of them burst into flames, some of them would appear and disappear because they were here, but if you get energetically tuned to this, then you can flip-flop between the two halves of the torus, so to speak. And the matter in their bodies would do that. So Tesla in the 1920s built something that would stabilize your ZTR, as it's called, your zero-time reference. And let me explain what that means. Here is space-time, here is time-space. In the middle is zero time. You're not in space, you're not in time. When you go in there, apparently it looks kind of gray. And in zero time, we all have a point at which, when we were conceived, where the transient body, or the spiritual body, and the physical body join. As we get older, there's like a widening cone between the physical and the metaphysical self. That forms your biological age. If you mess with the ZTR, it's like you push the top over, but the bottom is still where it is. This gap creates great static, which in some cases causes you to burst into flames, in other cases causes you to go comatose. Sometimes your sense of time gets really screwed up. For example, some of these guys, you'd have to rub their skin for days at a time, the exposed flesh. They would just be paused, because in their time, only a few seconds have gone by in what amounts to years of time for us, or maybe weeks of time. So by rubbing them, you could eventually get them to slow down and rejoin their time reference with where we are. Now, one of the things Daniel told me was that some people were able to psychically reconstruct the ship from memory. They remembered that they were on a ship. They remembered where the ship was, where the floor was, where the walls were. They were the ones that came out okay. So that was part of the research. Now, since that time, the Philadelphia experiment was not dropped. It has since been parlayed into technologies, including jump gate technology, as I've heard that it's been called, in which they now can warp you from one place to another. There's apparently, as you guys disclosed with Deacon, a stable jump gate between Earth and Mars, and an inhabited base on Mars. I heard that too. Daniel also came across the fact that Mars had been inhabited in ancient history, and that there were artifacts all over the place. He also said he saw a photograph of astronauts waving next to a pyramid in basic NASA spacesuits. So it's not easy when people realize that you've been lied to and that there's a lot that you don't know, but that is the reality of what's happened. So they got a chair out of the UFO and they started to use these same principles and took it even farther. Now, one guy actually was crazy enough to go back in time and kill his father because he wanted to see what would happen, I guess. You know, there's some nasty guys working in Black Ops, and it's also almost a suicide move, you would think. Well, he felt great. I mean, he went and he killed his father, which apparently resolved a lot of anger issues for him. And he came back, I'm fine, yeah, everything's fine. The next day, or a couple days later, he stepped out on traffic, got hit by a car, and was instantly killed. So from that, they came to the conclusion that time is like a living fabric that repairs the tears that are made. It repairs the rips that are made. as much as it can. The most interesting thing that Daniel ever told me was, of course, well, first of all, before we get to that, your ZTR determines your absolute biological age. So apparently, if you travel into the future and your ZTR says you were born in 1956, let's say, you travel into the future 10 years, 15 years down the road, in a matter of a couple hours, your body becomes 10 or 15 years older. When you travel back in time, you revert back to the age you were when you left in a relatively short time. Now, this is very anomalous, suggests a very multidimensional component to the biological aging. So they had to find a way to shift the ZTR in order to send somebody through, and Daniel believes they had, but he did not have access to that information. They were taking wavelengths of the psychic's mind, analyzing them, and trying to figure out a way to mechanically generate them so that they wouldn't need the psychic, because they were using a variety of psychics, but Duncan Cameron happened to be the one who had the most success. So they sent people through time. There was a 20-year wave that came out, which apparently was a natural harmonic of the Earth in its rotation. And you could plot on the wave very precisely what time somebody was in by how far the wave went. If the wave got to here and then stopped, they could calculate, okay, well, that's 1996, January 15th, or whatever. The wave keeps going. Well, this is what really drove these guys crazy, is that there was a certain point, they were sending people into the future. There was a certain point on that 20-year wave as they're traveling along through a time tunnel in which all the waves, 100-some plus waves from the chair, and that was just the number that they had analyzed. There were hundreds more that they weren't even looking at. The amount of cables coming out of the chair was in this 2-inch by 3-inch thick box coming out. Huge amount of data. All the graphs would go flatline for like 5 or 6 seconds and then come back online. But during that time, you couldn't see anything. The graphs were gone. Well, then they asked the people, what happened to you during this time? And they said, it's the most fantastic thing I've ever experienced in my whole life. It was like I'm one with the galaxy. I could be a star, I could be a planet, I could zoom in on a planet. I had access to all knowledge there ever was to know. I could be a subatomic particle, I could be an atom, a molecule. I could fly anywhere, do anything, know anything, be anything, and it seems like there's no time, it just goes on eternally. It's absolute ecstasy. It's the most wonderful thing I've ever experienced in my whole life, and you do not want to leave. When you first hit it, it's like hitting a really intense bump, like you slam into something. So they called it the bump, or the discontinuity. And the experience of going out of the reality that you know, they called it the full out, that you would have this full out experience. So then all the graphs went silent, drove these guys crazy because they wanted to be able to replay that part and analyze the waves, but they couldn't. So then they're looking at the timeline, and they look at this 20-year wave, and they find out exactly how far it went right up until poof, everything goes flat, and it was December 21st, 2012. So here we get into your whole 2012 thing. Well, the Law of One said something was going to happen in 2012, the channel material I was talking about before, and when Daniel starts telling me this, I'm aware that this is not a guy who's lying, because there were too many things that I asked him, I cross-examined him, I met him on multiple occasions. And then when you guys came out with your Henry Deacon testimony, it really was fascinating. So before we go any further, I want to make sure I mention my website. My website is divinecosmos.com, divinecosmos.com. And you can read about more of this testimony, more of all this kind of stuff I'm talking about. There's audio interviews that I've done in an archive. We have a great CD series that we've put together called The Science of Peace, which goes into a lot of the consciousness science, the understanding this stuff. Now, this is what I came to. We have a zero-time reference when we're born. Time and space become one at the moment of our conception. Daniel doesn't agree with me, but I believe that 2012 is the ZTR of the Earth, that it's a new birth of the Earth's energy body. And it makes a lot of sense. So it's at that moment that we have this implosion, and everything kind of comes together. Now, Don Elkins, the guy who was the questioner of the law